Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for attending session 5 out of 8 for our class from the Center for the Study of Digital Life, where I'm the president. My name is Mark Stallman, and I really want to thank Shrikant and his 52 Living Ideas for helping us out with this class. We've been through quite an amazing series of discussions up until now. Your participation in the Q&A is enormously important for this. This is an experimental course. Shrikant and I have plans for doing this again in 22 and many plans beyond that. So I thank you very much for being involved. Today's session will be the first of 2 on the West sphere. 3 spheres, East, West, and digital is the overall theme. The past 2 weeks, we've had amazing guests in John Alton and Phil Midland for 2 discussions of the East sphere. We began 5 weeks ago with 2 introductory classes. First, on the topic of a history of the history of civilizations, to give us a context of how other people have dealt with these questions. I will once again say that this is not the equivalent of Hegel's philosophy of history, but it does touch on some of the same subjects. I'm going to open with a statement that I've made in opening and closing each of the previous sessions. And I look forward to elucidating this, particularly with respect to the West sphere this week and next. We will then complete the 8 weeks following that with 2 sessions on the digital sphere. I want you all to remember that we no longer live in the modern age. Digital technology has already fundamentally restructured society. And in order for us to act responsibly in this new era, we're going to have to understand the causes and consequences of this paradigm shift. This class is designed to help with that understanding. The last 2 sessions by my colleagues were conducted with slides. I did not do that for the first 2, but we're going to do some slides today. So let's see how this goes. Shrikant, could you throw up the slides, please? Yeah, you need to go to slideshow. There we go. Thank you. And Shrikant, could you also please explain the format to folks, what we're going to do today, so that they know what's coming up?
All right, folks. So as I say in every one of these sessions, you're about to be hit with a fire hose of ideas. You need to keep track of all your questions with pen and paper. There'll be a Q&A session immediately after the presentation, or where we will collect all the questions from everybody, look at the shape of the questions, map them out, and then go through them mostly from general to more specific. With that, back to you, Mark.
Thank you. So as you recall, we began in the first session dealing with the topic of the decline of the West. And so our basic premise here is that of the 3 spheres, East, West, and digital, the one that we live in, or most of us live in and have spent our lives in, is the one that is now recognized widely to be in decline. Therefore, the question, can the West recover? Next slide, please. What you're going to see for the first time here is a series of bullet points. We'll leave them up for a while for you to look at them. The slides can be made available if you like also. So let me begin with this approach. Can the West recover from its decline? This is a decline, as you recall, that was first signaled in Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, Volume 1, published in German in 1918. So we're 100 years into this process. And my answer to his question is yes, it can. Now, obviously, answering the question that way, which is potentially an optimistic answer, depending on how you approach these topics, is not a definite, not a for sure. It is only a possibility. It's a possibility that depends, in fact, on people like us. How could this possibly happen? How could the West recover from its decline? And the answer is a very straightforward one. The West will have to become the West again in order to recover. As we go through this presentation today, we will talk about how it diverged from being the West, attempting to build something quite different, and failing in that effort. We must recover the virtues which were at the core of Western civilization. As we've been saying, each of the three spheres are now on a quest to recover. It is particularly noticeable in the East, as you've heard over the past 2 weeks. It is also evident, as you will hear when we get to the topic of the digital sphere, but it is the West that is probably least definite, least committed, most confused, most conflicted. But we really have no choice. So how can this be done? Do we walk around with sandwich boards, listing the original virtues, particularly the cardinal virtues? No. In fact, it's very important to recall here that what underlies everything we're discussing was the topic of the second session, which is to say formal cause. If there was not an underlying formal cause directing us towards a recovery of the virtues, this would be highly unlikely that this could happen. But there is, in fact, that formal cause. Digital technology itself shifts us to a new paradigm, and in that process gives us the opportunity to recover the virtues. Why might this work? What is it about digital technology as a formal cause that could direct us to a recovery of the decline of the West? And the answer here is a straightforward one, but one that is probably not so obvious. Digital retrieves our memories. What do I mean by that? As it turns out, we tend to pattern our own approaches, our biases, our prejudices, our premises for our arguments based on the architectures of the communications technologies we habitually use. As I've noted before, I was at one point a computer architect. I've designed a number of commercial products. I'm not an engineer. I studied genetics and theology in college and graduate school. But nonetheless, I found myself in the computer industry early on and having to sort out what it was that I was required to now design. And what I discovered in that process is that computers are effectively nothing but memory engines. You wouldn't know that from the name computer. You might think that computing is what computers actually do. Not true. What computers actually do, which is to say, the vast, vast majority of the time that is spent in machine cycles is shuffling things around in memory. Everybody knows when they go to buy a computer, buy a smartphone, basically the only decision you have once you've made a brand decision is how much memory will be built into the machine. We all know the difficulties that we have when memory is corrupted. We might sense that the relentless activity of computers is to try to remember things which then need to be retrieved so they can be acted upon. So information processing turns out to really be remembering. Next slide, please. Shifting now from the possible route going forward, as we've said before, the causes of the situation in which we're in also need to be understood. So therefore, where did the West go wrong? If there was, at one point, a West based upon the virtues, which now need to be retrieved, where did the fork in the road occur? Remembering, as Yogi Berra said, when you come to a fork, take it. And in fact, we did. The fundamental formal cause, the lost cause, if you will, that sent the West off in a different direction, ultimately leading to the decline that we are experiencing, was the printing press. Now, there's a lot of interesting literature on the topic of the printing press. Much of it, in fact, will be picked up in the next slide in terms of what the effects were of this formal cause. But I'm going to highlight one of them in particular to you, which is to say, the printing of the book of Revelation. So recall that print is usually identified with Gutenberg and his printing of the Bible. Shrikant in 52 Living Ideas is doing something fascinating with all of this. And I recommend that you take a look at the rest of what he is doing and participate if you can. He is now examining, and they're well into this process, a key text from the East Sphere, and that, of course, is the Tao Te Ching. As it turns out, he is also now conducting the beginning of a more lengthy examination of the Bible, in particular, the fourth of the Gospels, the Gospel of St. John. Well, there's another book in the New Testament, and it's at the very end. So as some of you may have experienced, when a book falls into your hands, you might be inclined to go to the back of the book. If you don't want to just simply fall into the linear process of the story that's being told, you can get around that. Go to the last chapter. Read about how this all turns out. And that's exactly what people did. Now, the Gutenberg Bible, of course, is printed in the mid-15th century. It took a while. Arguably, it took well into the 16th and 17th centuries for these effects to begin to be felt. But the printing of the book of Revelation, which the Catholic Church had very rarely highlighted, it is not something that is emphasized. And so throughout the 1,000 plus years of the use of the Bible, in particular the New Testament, Book of Revelation got very little attention until it was printed and widely distributed. So what does that mean? Well, as it turns out historically, the printing of the Book of Revelation convinced many people that they were in the end times. You might have thought, and some have even written about, whether the literal millennium, the year 1000, led to an enormous outpouring of concern about the end times. Tom Holland wrote a fascinating book about the subject. It did not. Under the previous Scrabble conditions, very few people read the Book of Revelation. They would have heard stories about it for sure, but it did not provoke any significant outpouring of concern about the end times. Print did that. And this conviction that the world was coming to an end led to many results. Most importantly, what had been a relatively balanced society, balanced in terms of the authority of the state, the secular authority, authority of the church, religious authority, and how all of this played out in terms of social organization, that was finished. This is not a controversial point. Typically, what is stated is that this ended feudalism. But it ended feudalism in favor of what? I will here recommend to you one of the more fascinating accounts of this transition. A British Marxist historian by the name of Christopher Hill wrote a book titled A World Turned Upside Down, and that is exactly what happened. The paradigm shift associated with print, I'll remind you here that we are going through an even more fundamental paradigm shift today as we move to digital. That print shift literally turned the world upside down. Next slide, please. What did it do? Here's a long list of terms, some of which probably mean more to you than others, but the world was reformed. Here we have, once again, the key term form and formation and reformation. Reformation is a term that does not just simply apply to the rise of Protestant churches. It is an excellent description of what this paradigm shift led to. The world felt as if it was being reformed. What we now think of as science, as if it had only just begun, which is being suggested by many involved, science, as we know it, was a result of this printing press caused change in our paradigm. Capitalism did not exist before the printing press in a recognizable fashion. Ultimately, the Enlightenment winds up being what many people today continue to try to champion. My opening statement should indicate to you that I'm convinced, we are convinced, that in fact the Enlightenment has become obsolete. Nation states are a result of the printing press. Constitutions. The United States of America, by the way, vast majority of those who came initially to settle in the United States, particularly those coming from England, had lost a civil war which had been based upon the notion of the end times. So in many ways, Pilgrims, Others, Virginia, other colonies or efforts to come and populate what was believed by most involved to be the Garden of Eden. Their conviction that the world was coming to an end was remarkably widespread and not something that is probably taught in most textbooks about American history. There wasn't yet a nation state, but the formation of a nation state, the Constitution, and so forth, that was all a result and effect of the printing press in many ways as well. But underneath this, you also had, in particular, since the medieval church had been pushed aside, you had the rise of a significant number of secret societies. The vast majority of those who signed the US Declaration of Independence and Constitution would have described themselves as Freemasons. You drive into any, the town square in pretty much any New England town, and you'll find a Masonic temple. Some have suggested, in fact, that the American Revolution, which, as you probably know, if you are familiar with the history, involved remarkably few casualties. In fact, very few real pitched battles. One explanation given is because both sides, both the British and the American troops, were largely Freemasons. Turns out that the whole idea of an invisible college was also built into this. So some of the names you may be familiar with, Rosicrucians and others, had a field day under these circumstances. And I would suggest that all of these terms should be brought together under the heading of modernism. What did I say to begin with? We no longer live in the modern world. So that means that this list that I put in front of you, we are claiming that these are all obsolete, that none of these things will be carried forward with the kind of social acceptance and even enthusiasm. And that's probably something you've already experienced all around you. Next slide, please. So how does digital, as a formal cause, shift us away from all of those print-based effects? Now, I'm not going to go into great depth here. We have done this, in fact, in some other sessions that Srikant has organized. But we are undergoing a remarkable subconscious shift in the psychology of our inner senses. This is a change in our psychology that has not happened for a very long time. In particular, digital causes our inner senses to shift away from a mode focused on fantasy to one focused on memory. I've already explained here how the internal architectures of computers are memory machines, and we adopt that as an extension of our own internal memory. I'll just briefly note here, and there may be some questions when we get to Q&A. What does this have to do with Mark Zuckerberg? What does this have to do with the name change at Facebook? In fact, the metaverse, which is behind the name change to Meta, is a fantasy world. And so what is happening here is a doubling down on the part of Facebook in favor of fantasy. If I were on Wall Street, which is where I spent many years and was my primary career, I would be writing a major piece about how this is going to fail. I am very confident that, in fact, this is the last ditch effort to save an approach which has driven us insane, and it will not succeed. Instead, what is most likely to happen is that we are going to remember a great deal more about our history, in particular, our history before the printing press, the origins of the West. One of the mailing lists that both Shrikant and I participate in had an exchange today from a fellow, quite expected, in fact, where he says the West began with John Locke. Clearly, not true. John Locke comes along thousands of years after the West was actually begun. So what he is clinging on to is the modern world. That's his personality, that's his background, that's his commitments. That's not where we are today, however. What this remembering of the origins of the West and the retrieval of our virtues means is a restoration of the importance of natural law. This is a subject I suspect very few on this call have spent much time studying. So therefore, next week, I will do my best to give you an outline of what I mean by natural law, and in particular, describe to you why this demands a new set of sciences. So the notion of a paradigm shift, most of us were introduced to that notion in the 1962 work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. That is, in fact, very much what we're now going through. And as a result, the sciences, particularly the social sciences that we've been living with, will need to be replaced. That'll be the topic of next week's session 6. But beyond this, we're being forced to remember the most important thing of all, what it means to be a human. Needless to say, robots, algorithms are not humans, despite the billions of dollars that are now being spent to build algorithms that can pretend to be humans. It won't work. We won't be fooled. In fact, they will not have a human soul. The soul is probably also a topic that has not been a part of your formal education, but it will be. We are retrieving what it means to be human, and therefore we must examine what it means to have a human soul. And our assertion is that for the West to recover from its decline, it must once again make virtue, which was at the heart of Western society, from the Greeks all the way through to the printing press, that once again has to become paramount. Next slide, please. Okay, Stallman. This is a pretty strange set of ideas you've been giving us. Is there any evidence that anything like this is actually happening? Or are you just making all this up? Is this wishful thinking? Are you just hoping against hope that something like this can occur? And I would suggest that everyone on this call has experienced in ways small and large that this process is underway. I'll begin by reminding you what we've talked about over the last 2 weeks, which is to say how the East Sphere is already aggressively moved down this road. The Tao Te Ching that Shrikant and 52 Living Ideas have been examining for a while now is not an obscure text in China. In fact, as you've heard, the Chinese have been teaching the Tao Te Ching, the Yi Ching, Confucian Analects, and many other classics up and down Chinese society. This recovery of the way is effectively policy in China, and aspects of the corresponding approaches to the way in places like Japan and India have also, over the course of the past decade, become widely retrieved. In addition to the Tao Te Ching and the Bible, Shrikant and I have been talking about the retrieval of key texts in the Indian civilization. So stay tuned for how this is likely to turn out, and invite your participation. But beyond what's happening in the other two spheres, just look around you. Try to sort out what the headlines are telling you. Try to figure out what is behind all of the screaming, shouting, gnashing of teeth. Those of us who have been around for a while, I'm 73, so I guess I count. There has always been, throughout my life, a relatively coherent narrative for the West sphere. This was constructed in quite elaborate detail, particularly after World War II. That narrative has now collapsed. Those who continue to cling to it are like those after the Titanic searching for a lifeboat. The ship is going down, and people know it. This is expressed in a wide variety of ways. The abandonment of educational institutions is accelerating. It began arguably with young kids, as the homeschooling and charter school movements began to push back against what was happening in the required education of children. It is now very much moved on to the universities. Clearly, student loans have contributed to this. Clearly, the woke requirements for discourse have contributed to this. But I would say that underneath this, there's become a widespread recognition that it simply isn't working. The notion of going to college in order to meet people may still obtain, but probably not so much. The notion of going to college to break away from your parents and have 4 years of partying probably still applies. But the notion you're going to get a serious, thorough, life-shaping education in colleges today has almost entirely been abandoned. But there's more. Politics has become such a goat rodeo that it reminds me, and perhaps you, of the end of Thelma and Louise. It has wound up in a group of people shouting at each other as they go off a cliff without leaving any skid marks. I was supposed to actually show up on Steve Bannon's War Room this past weekend, but Bannon canceled our panel, which is going to be on the topic of transhumanism, which, by the way, is the digital sphere, because it wasn't going to be controversial enough. The amping up of the need for scandal, at the same time that people see through the scandal. So we have this battle going on in which fewer and fewer people are convinced that what they're hearing on the news is true, at the same time that it all becomes more and more extreme on all sides. Politics has already gone over the precipice. Economics, as we probably also know, taking a look at what has happened in the recent attempt to completely change the structure of taxation, as one example, it has increasingly become intolerable for a larger and larger segment of the population in the United States and worldwide. There are many people who have convinced themselves that we have lost control of the money supply. We've lost control of any stability associated with currencies. This is one of the reasons, of course, for the excitement, which is justified in terms of a paradigm shift about blockchain and Bitcoin. When you think about things like NFTs, you can try to draw parallels to sponsors in the past for artists. But the net of this is our economics has become intolerable. Now, one of the things that we're doing at the Center for the Study of Digital Life is shifting a good deal of our focus to the next generation. So, as exciting as it is to talk with people my age, the smart 20-something has been a particular focus of our efforts, and this is going to be doubled down in 2022. We will be launching a university called Trivium University next year. The target audience for this is this category of people who have already finished college, have become disillusioned, have figured out that things are simply not working, and we're hoping to then give them literally a classical education. They are looking for answers. The notion that these kids are going to wind up in Zuckerberg's metaverse is laughable. That is not the next step after video games. Next slide, please. This is, in fact, the last slide. I get until about 45 minutes after the hour to make my presentation. So lo and behold, here we are on the closing statement here. And I suspect we will wind up with many questions from you. I hope you've been taking notes. I hope you've been writing down the questions that you want to ask. Inevitably, the question is going to be, what can we do about all of this? Interesting story you've been telling us, Mr. Stallman. Now what do we do? The first and most important thing that we need to do is to understand the effects of these technologies on all of us. While I may seem to have been expressing some extreme views here, while it may be unusual for you to think about technology, in particular digital technology, formally causing these sorts of incredible upheavals, understanding the effects of technology will help you to act responsibly in what is no longer a modern world. I would suggest you might also want to study the history of paradigm changes. We've been through quite a number of them. I have found that in my conversations with my colleagues, discussing how an oral world became a Scrabble world, how a Scrabble world became a print world, how a print world became an electric world, and how that electric world, which we've lived our lives in, is now becoming a digital world. That sequence of paradigm changes seems to be very important for people to understand the situation in which we're in. In other words, this is not by any means the first time that human society has been through this sort of a change. But crucially, in all of this, learning how to take responsibility for your actions, as simple as that might sound, is not simple at all. Marshall Mcluhan, who is a critical underlying resource for everything we've been talking about here, Understanding the effects of technology, there is no other place to start that than with Marshall McLuhan, particularly his laws of media. In 1969, he wrote a letter to a Catholic theologian you may be familiar with, Jacques Maritain, in which he said there is a deep-seated repugnance in the human breast against understanding the processes in which we're involved. The second sentence is the key. Such understanding implies far too much responsibility for our actions. We will not be able to recover the West unless we can take responsibility for our actions. And I'll just close with a series of specific items that may lead to questions. We must bring back virtue into our lives. One of the more interesting media properties that television has generated, of course, is named vice. If you're going to understand virtue, you're going to have to also understand vices. That in itself will take you down some very interesting paths. And there's a great deal of important literature to help you to do that. The basis of any society, not just the West, but certainly if we're going to recover the West, we must strengthen the family. There's also a lot of literature on this. And I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it out loud. And I welcome the questions that may come from this. You're going to wind up going to church, and you're going to mean it. When asked for an elevator pitch on what we're undergoing now, I have often said, it's very simple. Less work, more religion. Many people have begun to write about a post-secular world. This is another recognition of what we're going through. You will wind up taking the often offhanded and easy, glibly, to say, love your neighbor, far more seriously in this process. And finally, with the help of digital technology, we are heading into a period in which we will really have no choice, and it will become a huge public discussion, particularly as the robots and algorithms become more and more obvious. We will need to remember what it means to be a human being. Again, thank you all very much. Let me conclude speaking about this with a statement that I've used so far in every one of these sessions. We no longer live in the modern world. All those attributes, I could have added things like democracy and so forth to this. They're now obsolete. They're going to be replaced with something else. It is a digital technology that has done this to us. I'm not forecasting here. I'm describing something that has already occurred. It's been underway, in fact, for decades. If we are to act responsibly in our own lives and in the lives of people around us, we're going to need to understand the causes and the consequences of this paradigm shift. Thank you very much for attending the class. Thanks, Shrikant, for helping organize all of this. We've got an exciting set of questions I know ahead of us. This class has been designed to help you with an understanding, and I hope we're stimulating some of that here today. Thank you all very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. All right, folks. So it's now for questions. In order to ask questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. What we're going to do is we're going to collect all the questions. See, this time Mark is, I mean, this is the domain that has been opened up is incredibly large, okay? So the rules are keep your questions brief, no commentary, just questions. Try to keep the questions brief. We're going to collect all the questions, look at the entire pattern of questions that emerge, and then we are going to pose the questions to Mark one by one. Okay, so that's the plan. So we're going to start with David Johnson, followed by James. Go ahead, David, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mark. Are you simply afraid of change, of the possible fusion of man and machine that the digital age will bring? And are you advocating a return to dark ages where religion was predominant?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is going to be James. James, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned secularism, and I think that the paradigm for me is that there's a world, and that's globalism. That's a global entity, and then there's a secular forces in the world. And are you advocating more secularism? People join religions. People fight against what used to be called Orientalism. Is this your idea of the Western conscience?
Okay, very good. Very good. Give me just a second. Hold on. All right, let's take the next question. Is it secularism? Give me a second here. All right, next question is from Daljit. Daljit, go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. Another provocative session as always. You know, my question revolves around the idea of, are we heading to a Neo Feudalistic state? We're seeing signs of that within the global economy, and I'm wondering if we're going to retrieve feudalism in any profound way in your viewpoint, especially the worlds in which you circulate. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Wonderful. Are we recovering Neo Feudalism and secularism? Okay, James, let me do one thing. I was slightly distracted. Can you go ahead and rephrase your sentence, your question in maybe one sentence? James.
Okay, sorry. Is secularism a, in this sense, tendency? Do you mean it's a tendency away from unity, or do you mean do you see it as a kind of like an enemy of the West, so to speak? I heard that in some of your texts. So, do you see globalism as a negative tendency that we need to fight back against?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Are secularism and globalism and negative tendencies? Okay, excellent. Next up is going to be Vanderberg. A. Vanderberg, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, but the most important question for me would be, do you associate memory also with cellular memory? So with the memory of the body that remembers actually everything. So trauma, recovery, embodiment.
Thank you. Is memory a cellular? You had another question?
Yeah, it's isn't the illness of the Western state the loss of animalism? So the realization that every matter is actually living.
Okay, thank you.
Or holy, yeah.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Jacob. Mike.
Yeah, great presentation, Mark. The question is, any advice for those of us in the workforce who fear financial pushback against speaking out publicly about what we're talking about here today?
Right. Okay, very good. Workforce and pushback. Very good. Thank you, Mike. Next up is going to be Jacob. Jacob.
Are there, you mentioned that fantasy will be displaced by memory. And I wonder if you could flesh out how that could possibly happen, considering how utterly immersed we are psychologically in fantasy.
Right.
Okay, excellent, excellent question. How will fantasy be removed? given the current conditions. Excellent. Next up is Chris. Chris, go ahead.
Thank you. And hey, Mark, I put this in the chat, and I guess this is a build on Jacob's point that he just made. The blowback on Meta has obviously been pretty significant from a lot of different circles. I think there's an interesting exception on Wall Street where there's some analysts that are pretty bullish on the idea of creating a different universe for us. So given your background, I'm curious what your take is on that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Next up is Rick. Rick, go ahead.
Thank you, and forgive me, I'm not as well read as many here. My intuition is I follow everything that I've heard and tend to agree, and I wanted to start with that. That's my intuitive senses. I'm hearing things that make sense to me, okay? That said, I'm reminded a little bit of—
Rick, go ahead and just state your question briefly. Go ahead.
I don't know how to ask the question, forgive me. I'm reminded of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, Hilary Seldon, speaking in terms of historical events as mathematical probabilities and likeliness, and having a prognostication, right? He's able to, right. And this is kind of, it feels like that's what I'm hearing. And the question is, how would you defend that? I think I'm hearing you say this is going to happen. We're going to have to, it's going to be inevitable that we will have to go back to virtue and spirit. Why is that? And it kind of follows Jacob's question in a way.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rick. Next up is Dave. So the question here is how do you actually justify this view of the future? How do you justify your view of the future? What's the process of justification? Thank you. Next up is Dave. Dave, go ahead. Dave, you need to unmute. What's your question?
That's always something. Towards the end, you were emphasizing religion and quoted, "Love your neighbor." And I would like to ask, is it time to tear down walls and start aiding the less developed nations? Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Should we be aiding less developed nations as a part of this? Or what about Simone? Simone, what's your question?
Hi, yeah, I put it in the chat, but just to reiterate, it was that you mentioned obviously re-engaging with religion. Do you see that as being the traditional religions, or do you predict the emergence of new religious forms or new religious traditions and rituals?
Wonderful. Excellent. All right, folks, this is an amazing set of questions. All right, so now let me go ahead and organize them and we will go from there. So let's see where to start with. Let's start with the most dramatic question about the fantasy. How is it going to be easy to remove fantasy when so many people are hooked onto it?
First, let me congratulate you all. I love these questions. This is a very important part of what we're doing here. Secondly, let me underscore that I'm not making any predictions. In fact, what I'm trying to do here is to describe what has already happened. So in many ways, the answers to your questions, which are sort of what comes next and how can I justify what comes next, I'll do my best to answer those questions, but you will hear from me primarily a description of how we are already well along in this process. We are decades into the shift to this new paradigm. The way that you know that something has lost its capabilities is when it becomes so incredibly forceful that you recognize that those who are promoting that particular approach have lost any sense of balance. So the most straightforward answer to how might it be that we would shift from fantasy to memory is all around us. The question is quite well put. It would seem on the surface that we have more and more and more extreme fantasy being thrown at us. That should be a signal to you that, in fact, what has become obsolete is not letting go. But I will give another perhaps technical psychological answer to the question here. It turns out that one of the efforts that we've completed at the Center for the Study of Digital Life, the URL, if you wish to check this out, is digitallife.center. So it's pretty simple. You will find a tab under Journal there, and you'll find a 200+ page book that we have assembled entitled The Ecology of the Inner Senses. So this will be a topic we'll pick up again next week on the topic of natural law. But psychology has also driven off the cliff without any skid marks. Modern psychology has no recognition of the soul. It has no recognition of the inner senses. And as a result, it can't explain any of these things. Memory and imagination are the two critical components as initially described by Aristotle, 4th century BC, as psychology, not just in Europe, but psychology throughout the West, certainly Islamic understanding, certainly Jewish understanding of psychology. It all revolved around the interaction between the inner senses. And so my claim is that the architecture of the technologies we use for communications defines our psychological sensibilities. To the degree that computers and digital systems become the backbone of our habitual communications, and this may be less true with this group given our age, it will be more true with children, the smart 20-somethings of the first generation who grew up in a digital world. Children being born today will be even more aggressively impacted by this. And so the shift from fantasy to memory is built into the technology. Now, this may be also a partial answer to the question about whether I'm afraid of change. And the answer to that, of course, is no. In fact, what I'm describing is a remarkable change. It is not possible for us to return to a dark age based upon this. Can't happen. Hasn't happened. It's not what we see around us. So my basic instruction here is just look around you, talk to your friends, listen to what's going on, and try to figure out the ground that has changed, because something quite dramatic has happened here. The Middle Ages necessarily provokes, particularly amongst those who are committed to the modern world, a whole lot of reaction, subconscious reaction. I understand that. We're not going back any more than what happened under electric conditions, where we all, to one degree or another, absorbed the notion that we were in an archaic revival. We didn't suddenly lose our faculties. We didn't suddenly become illiterate. We didn't become primitive. And yet the primitiveness evoked in us became enormously important. That will not be sustained. So the answer to the question of the shift from fantasy to memory is both a technical, psychological answer as well as what I believe is most useful to explain what is happening around us, and particularly what I've observed is happening in the first generation, the smart 20-somethings who have gone through this. I hope that's helpful.
Wonderful. Next question is going to be on secularism. Is
Right.
secularism bad? Is it a negative? Is globalism bad? Is it negative?
Right. I should also note for you that I do my best to not moralize about any of these things. I'm not advocating for what I'm discussing today. I'm attempting to describe what has already been underway for many decades, my observations of this. To quote Marshall McLuhan, changes like this always bring services and disservices. And perhaps more to the point, I'm not a Hegelian. I'm not describing here how history fulfills a divine plan. I'm not trying to describe any of this as a synthesis. I'm rather trying to describe to you a situation in which we retrieve from our past things that we thought that we no longer needed in order to deal with a new situation. And in fact, it is a radically new situation in which we live. Globalism is finished. It's done. You will not find anybody who was a promoter of globalism at a serious level who would advocate for a continuation of globalism. It is kaput. One of my favorite commentators on this is Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, in his last published book, at least that I'm aware of, called The World, winds up with a chapter in which he says, everything that I've spent my life on, going all the way back to his experiences in World War II and his undergraduate thesis, The Meaning of History, and beyond, Henry Kissinger has said, set that aside. We clearly are in something radically new here. Now, there's a new book that Henry has penned along with Eric Schmidt. I don't know Henry, so I probably shouldn't call him Hank, but I do know Eric. And this is their answer, which is to say artificial intelligence is the world in which we now live. Globalism has been replaced by three spheres. And so the question about globalism ultimately underlies the title that we're describing here. The global goal, particularly as it was expressed following World War II, particularly as it was incorporated in broadly what people call the New World Order, no longer is capable of attracting anybody's allegiance. Instead, what has happened is the world has already fractured into multiple competing spheres. We have selected three of them, East, West, and Digital, for these conversations. But it isn't a good thing or a bad thing that globalism is now obsolete. What I'm attempting to do here is to simply say, it's already happened. Secularism went out the window along with it. And here I would recommend, perhaps, amongst the many texts that have begun to recognize this, and you can just Google post-secular, and you wind up with a lot of people who weighed in on this. But the dialogue between Jürgen Habermas and now retired Pope Benedict XVI on the things that are missing, published a book with that title, I think might be helpful. I am not advocating here for religion. I'm not advocating here for any of the things that I do in my own personal life. What I'm saying to you is that it is our opinion examining the world in which we now live, that this has already happened. Anticipating and answering the question about whether these will be traditional religious forms or new religious forms, the answer, of course, is both. As we've seen from the surveys, as loaded as the questions might be, church attendance, broadly speaking, in the United States has declined across the board. That, I believe, is primarily a measure of the fact that children recognize that their parents going to church largely for social reasons that might have something to do with what the parents thought would be useful when the kids were being raised, that no longer is attractive. So it should not be surprising, in fact, that kids are not going back to the churches that their parents had attempted to raise them in. But at the same time, this exploration necessarily means a rediscovery, a remembering of what made the West so strong to begin with. And so there will absolutely be, has already been, quite a attempt to recover old religious forms at the same time that people certainly will be experimenting with new ones. And the answer to how this will all turn out is whether or not these forms can in fact supply what is missing. I'll just note for you here, one of the controversies that's been going on in the Roman Catholic Church is the Latin Mass. Today's Latin Mass, in fact, does not originate in the Middle Ages or feudal ages or dark ages, however we'd like to describe it. In fact, today's Latin Mass is a reaction to the printing press. The Catholic Church reaction to the printing press is the famous Council of Trent, which happens in the mid-16th century. The Tridentine Mass is so named because it was a standardization, and print was really what brought standardization into our lives. You can't have much of what I put on that list without standardization. And so the Tridentine Mass is in fact a print era reaction to a paradigm shift that had already occurred. The religious forms which we're all now beginning to think about. Do we join the synagogue? Do we try to start something brand new? These forms will be tested. They will be absolutely put to some very severe tests. And my strong suspicion is that many of them will fail those tests. They will not supply what is missing. All I'm saying to you now is that we are today in the midst of this shift. We're today in the midst of a shift to try to fill the void that has been left by a secular world. That secular world is now obsolete, cannot survive. Thank you.
Wonderful, Mark. So folks, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to ask Mark the deepest epistemological question that was raised by Rick. And I'm going to give you, and Mark has been answering multiple of the questions as he proceeds. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to give you one more chance of asking one more round of questions for Mark as soon as he's done answering this epistemological question. Okay, so you can, if you think that you want to bring something up, something that was triggered by what Mark has said, you will be able to do that. Okay, go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to, that will be the second round of questions. Okay, so Mark, Rick asked a really interesting question. He says, this is doing a prognosis. This is trying to see the future. People like Asimov etc. Many
Right.
other people have done that.
Right.
So what is, how do you do that? What is the epistemology of doing that? What is the thinking process for doing that? How do you
Right.
justify it? Can you say something more about that?
So what Rick is asking about, of course, is Isaac Asimov's series, the Foundation series. Foundation series has recently been made into a television series. A friend of mine, Paul Levinson, has been reviewing that series. I haven't watched it myself. He's been rather disappointed as a science fiction writer and as a reviewer. So let me see if I can weigh in here a little bit. The problem with Asimov's effort at psychohistory, which is the name that is given in Foundation series, is precisely the one that Rick identified. That this can somehow be modeled, this can somehow be mathematically approached. There are many others in our lives. Stephen Wolfram is maybe an example that some have run across. And in fact, you will find this all throughout today's social sciences. Economics is not the only one that attempts to model these activities. My answer to Rick, epistemological answer to Rick, is it doesn't work. There are no formulas for describing human life. Psychohistory, if it is based upon that sort of a formulaic, remember in the movie, what is the movie with the folks that can see the future? The Tom Cruise movie. Well, anyway, someone will remind me of the name.
Minority Report.
That's it, Minority Report. Thank you. In that, of course, there was no attempt at mathematically modeling the future. It was some combination of intuition and some sort of extrasensory capabilities and some absolutely unique people. I will tell you that the Pentagon has spent an enormous amount of money trying to identify those sorts of people. In fact, I know one of them, one of the people who has been singled out as somehow having a fortune-telling capability in all of this. I don't think anybody today, Rick, seriously believes that you can mathematically model human behaviors or the future of society. And so epistemologically, we've been thrown into a very uncomfortable situation. And so next week, I hope you return, Rick, we'll try to deal with your question in the context of natural law and the ultimate constructs associated with that. So my answer to you is no. It is not turtles all the way down.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. So we'll take the second round of questions. Again, folks, keep your questions brief. Again, we'll organize them and we'll do second round. It's going to be Joe, followed by Daljit and Vanderburg. Joe.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a fantastic presentation. There have been a decline in religious vocations overall. So what will the role of the laity be in the church in the future, since they'll be mostly dependent on the laity in order to exist?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Next up is going to be Daljit.
Hey, Mark, I just want to re-ask my question in the context of what you said about globalism being dead. Asking for a friend here, my friend Klaus. Is he a globalist? And are we moving towards a Neo Feudalism? I know you name Mr. Schmidt as one of your personal friends, and I look at a sort of technocratic plutocracy going on, and I'm curious to see, is that what we're moving to? Is that replace globalism? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Wonderful. Next one is by Vanderburg. Vanderburg, what's your question?
My question is, in the last episode, you talked about qi and the Chinese, focusing around the understanding of qi. So, and we call it soul. So is quantum physics helping us to recover towards soul, because they explain spirit is there before matter?
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so let's take these three questions. So the first, let's just go in order here. Laity, what is the role of laity?
The role of laity is crucial. I can guarantee you, because I am a Roman Catholic, because I participate in the development of the church, that the laity is already dramatically reshaping the church. Whatever you might think or know about the structure of the Roman Catholic Church, the current Pope, Francis, was specifically elected to tear down that previous structure. And the ultimate result of what he, and I suspect his successors, are going to try to do will be to, in fact, dramatically increase the role of the laity. Next weekend, with some colleagues, we're going to be presenting in the Bridgeport Diocese in Connecticut a 5-hour long symposium entitled the Digital Eucharistic Symposium. I'm going to take, with your permission, some of these questions along with me, because I'm sure that they will be on their minds as well. It's impossible for the current priesthood or hierarchy of the church to deal with a situation that we are already in the midst of. In fact, it will come from the bottom up. I have no confidence that a top-down effort to reform the situation could possibly succeed. That's out the window. We're in a situation in which it's going to wind up being a bottoms-up effort, and I believe that that is already what the Catholic Church is hoping will happen. We'll see how this develops over the next 10 plus years.
Wonderful. Next up is Daljit's question. Are we looking at Neo Feudalism?
No, we are not. What we are looking at is the application of the principle of subsidiarity, which some might find in feudal organization, but it can't look that way to us. Subsidiarity, of course, is the principle that says that organization needs to be such that the responsibilities are distributed and acted upon at the lowest possible level. So in a sense, this is my same answer that I just gave about the laity. It will turn out, since responsibility will be the key here, that you are not going to care who's elected president of the United States. That is not your responsibility. It will become more and more obvious that we have been drawn into what some have called the democratic surround, in which we're asked to take responsibility for something that we don't have responsibility for. That doesn't work anymore. And so as responsibilities are redistributed all throughout society, we're going to wind up with something that is not going to look feudal at all. The technologies of today have given us a radically different world. There is no going back. At the same time, there is retrieval. So we will bring from the past aspects that we thought we had discarded into a completely new situation. So no, this will not be a new feudalism. No, this is not going to be the structuring of a new aristocracy. We're not going to wind up with a new Holy Roman Empire. none of that is going to happen. Instead, this is going to be a bottoms-up revolution in which the laity and those who are closest to our lives, and in particular those who are taking responsibility, will be the ones who drive change.
Wonderful. I'm going to combine Vanderberg's question and ask it slightly differently, addressing some of the things that you just said. We discussed how China is recovering qi, and
Right.
you've talked about the West recovering the human soul. In the idea of subsidiarity, really the core is that the human beings have the soul. Each individual has the soul.
Okay.
And that is the starting point, that is the prime mover. So can you talk a little bit about how you see this concept of human soul being recovered in the West,
Right.
And compare it to what China is doing?
Well, this turns out to be, as you might expect, another version of the psychohistory question. This turns out to be another version of is there some way to unambiguously, mathematically model what we're going through? And I've already answered that as no, that cannot be done. So what do we substitute that reductionist approach with? And so here I will advertise for next week's session on natural law. And as you might expect, the West has its own version of qi. And we can isolate this. We can even take it away from the human soul. We can take it away from the whole topic of the psyche. So what I believe you've been asking about is whether we're going to, in this process of redefining physics, quantum mechanics was not the redefinition of physics that we need. The redefinition of physics is going to rediscover some older ideas about energy. So phlogiston might be familiar to some of you. You can look it up. There's a Wikipedia entry. Once upon a time, I actually was involved with an early VR company called Phlogiston. So I got to learn a fair amount about that. We are going to restructure our material and our social sciences based upon natural law. And that natural law will necessarily have us recovering many earlier notions that were reductively disposed of. The printing press forced us to standardize. The printing press forced us to be linear. The printing press forced us to imagine progress in a straightforward linear fashion. That's all out the window now. So there are many interesting suggestions that have been made. It may be that some of these will be funded. It may be that some of these are going to turn out to be very important for us. It may be the recognition of the Chinese reaching back and developing many aspects of qi is a stimulus for this in the West. But I can assure you that our current models, whether it's string theory, whether it's cognitive psychology, all of that is now on the chopping block. So it's a great time to promote and to get involved with and to bring forward and to help other people to understand and ultimately, in fact, to experiment on ideas that have been outside of the mainstream. The outlying is going to get a lot more attention as we move forward.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mark. Folks, if you have missed some of the earlier presentations, I want to refer you to the first two presentations as setting the context for these, of saying, history of civilization, as well as the formal cause, because formal cause is about the way of thinking that you need in order to access these things. All right. So, Mark, would you like to talk a little bit about, say your last statement, last summarizing statement, and give you a preview of what is left in this series?
Once again, I'm not afraid of change. In fact, it's already happened. The modern world and everything associated with it simply no longer works. Now what? Digital technology has tossed all of that overboard. And if we wish to act responsibly in what is a radically new situation, we've got a lot of work to do. Understanding causes, understanding effects is a critical component of this. Thinking through how the world has now reorganized itself already into multiple spheres is a critical part of this. And most importantly, working with each other to sort these things out. So what Shrikant has been doing with 52 Living Ideas is brilliant. What he's doing with this examination of the Tao Te Ching, the Bible, and other texts, potentially Indian texts and so forth, this is really quite unique. He deserves enormous credit. And so again, I want to thank you, Shrikant. We will spend next week delving into the topic of natural law and its relationship to reforming our sciences. Then we will conclude with 2 final sessions, which will be on the digital sphere and how that is likely to both cause significant potential conflicts, as well as potentially helping us to remember what it means to be human.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you all.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. We will see you next week. Bye.